As Europe burned and the Third Reich crumbled, the Allies hunted war criminals, but in secret, a shadow operation was underway. In the dead of night, American officers smuggled scientists who had engineered Hitler's deadliest weapons, turning enemies into assets. What was justice, and what was betrayal? April 1945. Germany lay in ashes. The air was thick with smoke and dust, carrying the acrid tang of burned timber, steel, and flesh. Cities that once pulsed with life, Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, had been reduced to skeletal ruins, streets choked with rubble and the hollowed shells of buildings. The once mighty Third Reich now existed only in echoes. The distant rumble of Allied tanks, the clatter of desperate refugees scavenging through debris, and the ghostly wail of trains carrying the displaced into uncertainty. The political structure that had ruled Europe with iron and terror had crumbled. Adolf Hitler's suicide on April 30 left a vacuum of authority, and the remaining Nazi leadership was either captured, hiding, or fleeing. Amid the chaos, ordinary Germans, men, women, and children, wandered like phantoms through bombed-out streets, searching for food, shelter, or lost family. Allied forces, victorious but wary, moved cautiously through the ruins, balancing the drive to document Nazi atrocities with the immediate need to maintain order in a land on the edge of anarchy. Every corner of Germany held a story of horror. Concentration camps were being liberated, revealing the depth of industrialized cruelty, emaciated survivors clinging to life, piles of personal belongings stripped from the dead, and the silent testimony of mass graves. For the Allies, the urgency was twofold: humanitarian relief for the living and a strategic reckoning with the dead. They needed to secure evidence, apprehend war criminals, and assert control over territories where Soviet and American ambitions were beginning to collide. In the midst of devastation, another dilemma emerged, cloaked in secrecy and moral ambiguity. Germany's scientists, engineers, chemists, and physicists, some complicit in the machinery of genocide, others responsible for weapons that had reshaped modern warfare, posed an unprecedented question: what to do with minds that could advance science but bore the taint of atrocity? American intelligence quietly began cataloging, interrogating, and recruiting, laying the groundwork for a plan that would become as controversial as it was transformative. Through streets littered with burnt-out tanks, collapsed bridges, and shattered lives, one could sense a fragile tension. The war was over, yet the struggle for Germany's future and the future of modern science was only beginning. Displaced voices whispered in the ruins, Allied boots echoed on cobblestones, and the world watched as the shadow of the fallen Reich stretched into the uncertain dawn of peace. The stage was set, and the choices made now would reverberate for decades, shaping not only post-war reconstruction, but the very trajectory of global power and technological innovation. In the rubble-strewn laboratories and hidden facilities of the Third Reich, a different kind of power lingered, one not measured in tanks or rifles, but in intellect and invention. By 1945, Germany's military science programs had produced some of the most advanced weapons the world had ever seen. Behind these marvels were men whose brilliance was inseparable from the horrors they enabled. Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket program at Peenemünde, stood at the apex of this paradox. A visionary whose innovations would later define space exploration, yet whose rockets had rained death on London and Antwerp, killing thousands in a war engineered by ideology. The Reich employed hundreds of specialized scientists, drawn from Germany's universities, research institutes, and military academies. Engineers in jet propulsion, chemists experimenting with nerve agents, and aviation designers pushing the limits of high-speed aircraft were all part of a system that fused genius with atrocity. At Peenemünde alone, some 5,000 engineers, technicians, and forced laborers worked on the V-2 rocket. Prisoners from concentration camps were pressed into service, enduring brutal conditions to construct and test weapons whose sole purpose was destruction. Every equation, Every test flight carried the weight of human suffering. Beyond rocketry, German laboratories had pioneered nerve gases and chemical weapons, though Hitler had restricted their battlefield use. Aviation innovators like Ernst Heinkel and Messerschmitt designers were producing jet fighters such as the Me-262, an aircraft years ahead of Allied designs. Scientists in U-boat technology, guided missile research, and even early nuclear experiments added layers to a terrifyingly sophisticated military-industrial machine. These were not idle theorists. They were architects of war, their intellect weaponized to serve a regime built on extermination and conquest. As Allied forces advanced, the United States faced a strategic dilemma. Intelligence reports confirmed that the Soviets were moving to seize key laboratories and personnel. Capturing these scientists could shift the post-war balance of power. Operation Paperclip, a program born of urgency and secrecy, aimed to bring as many of these experts to American soil as possible. Yet the plan carried a profound moral tension. Some of these men had actively contributed to war crimes. Others were considered indispensable to American security and the emerging Cold War. By summer 1945, the corridors of interrogation rooms and the makeshift holding centers of the Allies were filled with men whose hands had shaped the weapons of annihilation. The ethical calculus was stark: save knowledge to safeguard the future, or punish complicity and let it vanish. As America's intelligence services began cataloging von Braun and his colleagues, the fate of these scientists would not just determine the early Cold War. It would reshape the trajectory of rocketry, aviation, and modern science itself. The world watched, knowing that genius and guilt were now intertwined, and that the next battle would be fought not on battlefields, but in laboratories and moral reckoning alike. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended, but a new, invisible battle had already begun. In the shadowed offices of Washington, D.C., and the makeshift headquarters across Allied-occupied Germany, American intelligence officers faced a dilemma unlike any battlefield decision of the previous 6 years. The prize was not territory or prisoners of war, but minds. The elite scientists of the Reich whose work on rockets, jet aircraft, chemical agents, and advanced weapons could alter the future of military power. Operation Overcast, a covert initiative conceived in secrecy, was about to take shape. The task fell to a network of men operating at the intersection of military necessity and bureaucratic ingenuity. Alan Dulles, stationed in Bern and coordinating post-war intelligence for the Office of Strategic Services, became a pivotal figure, orchestrating contacts with informants, tracking German scientists, and assessing the strategic value of each individual. At the War Department in Washington, officers of the Counterintelligence Corps debated the unprecedented nature of the mission: how to secure men who had been part of the machinery of a genocidal regime without violating both domestic law and international principles. The challenge was both logistical and ethical. Many of the scientists were card-carrying members of the Nazi Party or the SS. Some had overseen forced labor programs at sites like Peenemünde and Mittelwerk, where thousands perished constructing the V-2 rockets. Yet their technical knowledge, rocketry, jet propulsion, chemical synthesis, was unparalleled, and the Soviets were already moving to claim laboratories in Thuringia and Saxony. Intelligence officers faced a stark choice: allow these men to fall into Soviet hands, potentially accelerating the Cold War arms race, or manipulate records, sanitize affiliations, and bring them to American-controlled facilities. Planning Operation Overcast required meticulous attention to detail. Lists were compiled, codified, and classified. Ranks, achievements, and potential liabilities were analyzed. Engineers like Wernher von Braun, whose V-2 designs had devastated London, were assessed not only for their genius but also for their culpability. Every name carried a risk, and every extraction had to be justified under the dual banners of national security and political expediency. Legal advisors debated whether falsifying personnel files would ever withstand scrutiny, while military planners arranged transport, billets, and secure testing grounds for the scientists once they arrived on American soil. The operation also revealed the human tension underlying Cold War pragmatism. Officers wrestled with the moral paradox of rewarding technical brilliance with freedom and employment, while the world was still absorbing the scale of Nazi crimes. As records were rewritten and bureaucratic walls constructed around each transfer, secrecy became paramount. Every telegram, report, and boarding pass was a calculated step in a game that balanced intelligence, morality, and the emerging contest with the Soviet Union. By late 1945, the first extractions were ready. Small teams of American officers, armed with lists, warrants, and a mandate to move quickly, prepared to descend on laboratories and estates across Bavaria, Thuringia, and Hesse. Transport was arranged under the cover of military necessity, personnel files sanitized, and high-level approvals obtained quietly from Washington. The mission was unprecedented, a covert relocation of men who had built weapons of mass destruction, now to serve the ambitions of a former adversary. As trucks rumbled through the ruined streets of post-war Germany and trains carried crates of equipment and mines alike, Operation Overcast moved from planning into execution. The first scientists would soon find themselves on American soil, stepping into a program that promised both opportunity and moral ambiguity. The world outside would see only the aftermath of the war, but within hidden offices and secured laboratories, a new front was opening, one where the lines between genius and guilt, justice and expedience, would blur in ways that would shape the Cold War and the future of modern science. As Europe struggled to breathe in the aftermath of war, a different kind of operation unfolded under the cover of night. Operation Overcast had moved from the planning room into the shadows of occupied Germany, where trains, trucks, and military aircraft would carry the Reich's most dangerous and brilliant minds across a continent still reeling from total collapse. The logistics were staggering. Scientists like Wernher von Braun, his colleagues in rocketry, and chemical experts had to be extracted without drawing attention, without provoking Soviet interference, and without alerting the press or war crime tribunals that prowled the region. Railcars rattled through shattered towns, loaded with equipment, crates of blueprints, and personnel whose identities had been rewritten on falsified passports. Midnight rendezvous occurred in abandoned stations, under the watchful eyes of American intelligence officers who knew that even a single mistake could derail the entire program. Trucks ferried scientists through rubble-strewn streets, past the remnants of German checkpoints and curfews imposed by occupying forces. Every mile carried tension. The Soviets were pressing from the east, eager to seize laboratories in Thuringia and Saxony, and Allied investigators were meticulously documenting Nazi complicity in crimes that had stunned the world. Among the men being smuggled, human contradictions surfaced. Engineers who had once proudly advanced Germany's war machine now faced a choice: cooperate with former enemies to preserve their freedom and knowledge, or risk exposure and prosecution. Some carried grudging loyalty to a defeated Reich. Others, weary of the collapse around them, moved quietly with pragmatic resolve. For the American officers orchestrating the operation, the moral compromise was undeniable. They were moving men whose work had killed thousands, yet whose knowledge might now safeguard the United States against a rising Soviet threat. From summer 1945 into early 1946, Operation Overcast transported more than 100 key scientists from Germany to secure locations in the United States, including Fort Bliss in Texas, White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, and eventually Huntsville, Alabama. Each extraction required precision timing: small, carefully coordinated convoys, falsified manifests, and constant vigilance against both external and internal threats. Soviet spies patrolled zones near occupied laboratories, ready to intercept or report movements, while war crimes investigators traced every affiliation, every laboratory, and every link to forced labor. Finally, in a quiet American airfield, the first major scientist arrived on U.S. soil. He stepped off the plane carrying the weight of Germany's scientific achievements and the darker shadows of complicity. The officers watching knew that with his arrival, Operation Overcast had crossed a moral line. The cost of national security, they understood, had become intertwined with justice deferred, and the questions it raised would echo for decades. The stage was set, not only for America's post-war technological dominance, but for a confrontation between conscience and strategy that history itself would judge. As the first German scientists settled into American laboratories and missile testing ranges, the quiet corridors of U.S. intelligence and military offices hummed with unease. Operation Overcast, soon renamed Paperclip, had achieved its immediate goal. German expertise was now under American control, rocketry and jet science ready to accelerate the nation's post-war ambitions. Yet behind the veneer of progress, a storm of moral and political questions raged. Internal memos circulated in Washington, revealing a bureaucracy caught between pragmatism and principle. Legal advisors debated whether the recruitment of men implicated in Nazi war crimes could ever be reconciled with both domestic law and international conventions. The tension was acute. Some scientists had been SS members, others had overseen forced labor at sites like Peenemünde and Mittelwerk, where thousands died constructing V-2 rockets. Human experimentation, chemical, physiological, and psychological, had stained certain research programs beyond redemption. Yet for military planners, these men represented unparalleled technical knowledge. Reports argued that the emerging Soviet threat required immediate assimilation of German expertise, and that ethical qualms, while noted, could not obstruct national security. In practice, this meant that SS affiliations were minimized, records sanitized, and involvement in wartime atrocities quietly overlooked. The debates were not abstract. In a 1945 memo, an intelligence officer wrote, "The question is not whether these men were complicit in war crimes, but whether their skills can be employed before the Soviets claim them." Within the War Department and the Office of Strategic Services, dissent simmered. Some feared public backlash should the operation be revealed. Others argued that moral compromise was the price of survival in a new world, where scientific advantage could determine geopolitical dominance. For the scientists themselves, the adjustment was jarring. They were valued for intellect but scrutinized for past affiliations. Some wrestled privately with guilt, others with pragmatism. And for the officers tasked with managing them, each day brought reminders that genius and culpability now traveled hand in hand. By 1946, the first American missile tests, rocket launches, and advanced aeronautical experiments were underway. The nation had gained a decisive technical edge, and yet the moral cost was impossible to ignore. The ethical minefields laid by Operation Paperclip would shadow U.S. science and policy for decades, a silent reminder that the triumph of knowledge had arrived on a foundation of compromise, secrecy, and human compromise. America had secured the future of its aerospace and defense programs, but the price, quietly acknowledged by few, was the human conscience. By 1946, the remnants of Germany's most advanced laboratories had been transplanted to the deserts and plains of the American Southwest. Fort Bliss in Texas, White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, and later Huntsville, Alabama, became the unlikely proving grounds for a new era of technological ambition. The very men who had engineered destruction for the Reich were now turning their knowledge toward the instruments of American power, rockets, jet propulsion, and the earliest experiments in spaceflight. Wernher von Braun and his team oversaw the conversion of captured V-2 rockets, adapting them to study high-altitude physics, guidance systems, and propulsion. By 1947, over 60 V-2s had been launched from White Sands, providing data that would lay the foundation for ballistic missile programs and eventually NASA's space missions. The scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of German engineers and technicians were employed across these facilities, working alongside American officers, scientists, and support personnel. Laboratories were rebuilt, test stands upgraded, and supply chains for propellants, alloys, and instrumentation established under strict security. Every launch, every test, carried the shadow of the weapon's origins. Rockets once intended to terrorize cities now illuminated the desert sky, symbols of both innovation and moral ambiguity. Engineers meticulously recalibrated guidance systems, studied combustion chambers, and refined structural designs, all with an eye toward both defense and exploration. These efforts were not abstract. By the early 1950s, the collaboration had produced the Redstone and Jupiter series of missiles, solidifying the United States' strategic position during the nascent Cold War. Von Braun's team would soon transition to the Army Ballistic Missile Agency and later NASA, directly contributing to the Saturn V rocket that would carry humans to the moon. The irony was unmistakable. The very individuals who had helped build instruments of mass destruction were now the architects of American ingenuity, launching satellites and astronauts into the void that had once been the domain of fear. Yet beneath the triumph lay unease. Whispers circulated within intelligence and military circles, as well as the wider public, questioning the moral cost of these achievements. How could a nation claim technological preeminence when the foundation rested on men whose hands had once built death? The tension between innovation and accountability would not vanish, quietly shaping the narrative of American aerospace and defense. The desert skies, lit by the trails of rockets ascending into the unknown, carried both hope and the weight of conscience, a reminder that the weapons of tomorrow were born from the conflicts of yesterday, and that history's judgment would always linger in the shadows of progress. The rockets that once tore through London's skies now soared over the deserts and plains of the American Southwest, but their legacy was far from simple. Operation Paperclip had delivered unparalleled technical expertise to the United States, accelerating missile development, jet propulsion, and space exploration. Wernher von Braun and his team became instrumental in launching America into the space race, transforming the Saturn V into the vehicle that would carry humans to the moon. Military programs gained sophistication at an unprecedented pace. Redstone, Jupiter, and Pershing missiles reshaped strategic calculations, providing the United States with a technological edge in the simmering tension of the Cold War. Yet beneath the triumph lay an ethical shadow. The men who had once worked under the Nazi regime, some implicated in forced labor and human experimentation, now walked freely in laboratories, their pasts sanitized for expedience. For intelligence officers and military planners, the calculus had been clear. Securing technological dominance justified moral compromise, but history would continue to debate that choice. Did national security outweigh accountability? Could scientific progress ever absolve complicity in atrocities? These questions lingered, unanswered, echoing in congressional hearings, historical studies, and public discourse decades later. The human cost was tangible. Families of Holocaust victims and forced laborers saw justice delayed, or denied entirely, as men responsible for death became architects of innovation. Meanwhile, the scientists themselves adapted to new identities and new lives, some wrestling privately with guilt, others embracing opportunity. Young American engineers learned directly from their former adversaries, absorbing knowledge once intended to destroy their homeland, unaware of the shadows beneath the formulas and blueprints. Laboratories and test sites became spaces where brilliance and compromise collided, where the pursuit of progress could not erase the moral questions embedded in every calculation. Paperclip's legacy extended beyond rockets and missiles. It reshaped geopolitics, feeding the Cold War's technological arms race, while leaving a complex moral inheritance. The United States emerged stronger, faster, and more advanced, yet each launch, each breakthrough, carried an invisible weight. A victory for science, for innovation, for national power, but a haunting reminder that the cost of progress was measured not only in dollars or meters, but in the uneasy balance between achievement and conscience. The shadows of the past lingered, invisible to the public eye but indelibly etched into the story of America's rise as a technological superpower, a reminder that history rewards ingenuity but never forgets compromise. Long after the guns fell silent over Europe, a different war unfolded in shadows and secret corridors. Operation Paperclip, born from the ashes of Nazi Germany, was less a battlefield conquest than a calculated struggle for knowledge, influence, and survival. While the world celebrated victory over fascism, American intelligence officers and military planners moved quietly to secure what no treaty could guarantee: the genius of minds once devoted to destruction. From the vantage of Washington and the hidden airfields of the American Southwest, the United States waged a silent war, a contest fought not with artillery, but with strategy, secrecy, and science. The scale of the operation was immense, revealed only decades later through declassified documents and archived memos. Intelligence files cataloged hundreds of scientists, engineers, and technicians, their skills assessed against both their technical value and their moral complicity. Bureaucratic machinery churned to falsify records, obscure affiliations, and transport personnel across continents under the cover of night. Trains rumbled through devastated European cities, planes crossed the Atlantic under radar of public scrutiny, and laboratories in Texas, New Mexico, and Alabama hummed with experiments that bridged wartime innovation and Cold War ambition. Every movement, every decision, was shrouded in a delicate balance between expedience and conscience. Within these operations lay profound human tension. Former Nazis, some implicated in war crimes, adjusted to new identities and unfamiliar landscapes. Officers and scientists alike wrestled with the ethical compromises demanded by national security. The knowledge gained propelled America into a technological era unrivaled in history. Rockets that would breach the stratosphere, missiles that would redefine strategic deterrence, and early steps toward space exploration. Yet behind each breakthrough lingered the shadow of moral ambiguity, the invisible cost of victory that would haunt public debate for decades. Cinematic in its scope, the story of America's silent war stretches from midnight flights over the Atlantic, carrying men and secrets across continents, to laboratories aglow with the fires of high-tech experimentation. It is a story of paradox, progress born from compromise, triumph intertwined with conscience, and national security purchased at the price of ethical ambiguity. As the rockets rose and instruments hummed, a quiet question lingered in the minds of those who orchestrated it all. How far can a nation go in the pursuit of power before history weighs the cost of its decisions? The silent war may have been invisible to most, but its legacy would shape the trajectory of science, strategy, and morality for generations to come.